In war, imitation isn't flattery, it's survival. By 1967, deep in the humid, triple canopy jungles of Vietnam, something unusual was happening. Elite American Long-Range Reconnaissance Patrol, LRRP teams, some of the most highly trained, disciplined, and lethal men the U.S. military had to offer, began to change. Their gear got lighter, their movements got slower, their ambushes shorter and sharper, and their silence, once uncommon, became near religious. Why? Because they had started patrolling alongside the Australian SAS. And what they saw there didn't just impress them, it shocked them. Imagine being one of the best trained recon soldiers in the world, schooled in stealth, map reading, small unit tactics, and jungle survival, only to find yourself outmatched in your own terrain. Not by technology, not by superior weapons, but by a handful of quiet men in faded uniforms who carried less gear, made less noise, and somehow knew more about the enemy than you did, even after seeing nothing. The Americans called them ghosts, and for good reason. Where a standard LRRP patrol moved with caution and precision, the Australian SAS moved with absence. Where Americans swept through with layered comms, overlapping sectors, and prepared contact drills, the Australians crawled, watched, waited, and then disappeared. No excess gear, no casual chatter, no wasted movement. At first, the differences were baffling. American operators were trained for endurance and fire superiority. Their rucks were heavy, their radios powerful, their weapons often set to full auto. The jungle was something to move through fast and quiet, but moved nonetheless. But the SS didn't move, they melded. LRP teams began to see things that didn't match their training. The Australians didn't eat the same rations. They packed dry, scentless food. They didn't blacken their faces. They painted them green and brown to match the filtered jungle light. They didn't carry as much water. They drank from the streams after careful filtration. And when the enemy appeared, they didn't ambush immediately. They watched, listened, memorized. And then, when the time was right, they struck like a knife in the dark. After a few joint operations, American teams began asking questions. Then they began taking notes. Then slowly, they began to adopt what they saw. Lighter gear, reduced movement, stricter camouflage discipline, and most importantly, restraint. Because in Vietnam, firepower was common, but silence was rare, and the Australians had made it a weapon. This wasn't about national pride. It wasn't about tactics on a chalkboard. It was about survival. And for many LRRP teams operating in the deadliest parts of the country, the lessons they learned from the Australian SAS weren't just useful. They were life-saving. This is the story of how two elite forces met in the jungle, and how one quietly changed the other forever. Because when the enemy is inches away and the wrong breath means death, you don't care who taught you the technique. You just thank them you're still alive. Before they crossed paths with the Australian SAS, American Long-Range Reconnaissance Patrols, known as LRRPs, were already among the best trained units in the U.S. military. These weren't line infantry. They were volunteers handpicked for endurance, marksmanship, navigation, and raw mental grit. Their job was simple in theory, deadly in practice. Insert deep behind enemy lines, find the enemy, track their movements, report back, and, if possible, harass them without getting wiped out. Operating in 4 to 6 man teams, LRRPs were the eyes and ears of larger operations. They carried M16s, PRC-25 radios, Claymore mines, and enough ammo to make contact and get out if things went loud. Their training focused on stealth, small unit tactics, rapid movement, and communication. They were fast, smart, dangerous, but they were still American. And that meant they came from a doctrine built on mobility, maneuver, and firepower. Even in small teams, LRRPs were expected to move swiftly, cover ground, and if discovered, fight their way out. Their gear reflected this: full rucks, multiple magazines, demolition charges, backup radios, sometimes even M79 grenade launchers. Many teams trained with the idea that if things went bad, they'd be extracted under fire and needed to be ready to shoot their way to the LZ. They knew the jungle was dangerous, but for many it was still something to move through, not something to become part of. In their early missions, LRRPs applied what they'd been taught, And it worked at first. They captured movement logs, ambushed supply lines, tracked down NVA staging areas, but it came at a cost. Contact rates were high. Extraction under fire was common. Patrols were often compromised before they could complete their recon objectives. Sometimes it was small things, a glint of metal, a snapped twig, the scent of soap or tobacco carried on the wind. Other times it was just the tempo, moving too fast, too far, too loud for too long. The jungle punished momentum. Even when they succeeded, LRRPs started to notice something troubling. NVA and VC trackers were adapting. Ambushes were tighter. Reactions were quicker. Patrols vanished. The enemy wasn't running anymore. They were watching. And in some areas, American patrols were walking into zones that felt prepared. Then came 1967, when American recon units were paired with Australian SAS patrols. What they saw challenged everything they thought they knew. These men didn't just sneak through the jungle. They barely moved. Sometimes an entire patrol would spend 3 days in a 200-meter stretch of forest, watching, sketching, listening. It was maddening to some Americans at first. "Why aren't we doing something?" one LRRP reportedly asked a SAS patrol commander. The response was simple. "We are." The Australians weren't after enemy casualties. They were after enemy patterns, patrol times, supply drops, rest stops. They studied the rhythm of the jungle until it gave up its secrets. And that was when the LRRPs realized something. Maybe speed wasn't the advantage. Maybe the real power belonged to the man who waited, counted the footsteps, and didn't fire at all. The jungle was about to teach the LRRPs a new kind of warfare, and their teachers spoke in whispers, not gunfire. The first time American LRRPs patrolled alongside the Australian SAS, it wasn't camaraderie. It was curiosity. The orders came down quietly. A joint recon operation in a heavily trafficked NVA transit corridor near the Cambodian border. The Americans, armed with M16s, claymores, and radios, arrived ready to move. They expected a coordinated patrol, perhaps some intelligence sharing, maybe a firefight. What they didn't expect was silence. The SAS team said almost nothing. From the moment they stepped off the LZ, the Australians communicated in hand signals and eye contact. No radios. No whispered plans, just motion and stillness, as if every step had already been agreed upon days in advance. The American point man, used to regular status checks and terrain updates, found himself glancing over his shoulder, confused by the absence of chatter. The SAS men behind him hadn't disappeared, but they might as well have. They moved like smoke. Even their gear made no noise. No clinking buckles, no loose straps, no metal on metal. Their faces were painted in a camouflage pattern the Americans had never seen before. Subtle earth tones, flecked with green and brown, matching the dappled jungle light almost perfectly. Their rifles were taped and dulled. Even their boots seemed to blend into the undergrowth. And they didn't move fast, they moved right. What would have taken the LRRPs 2 hours took nearly 5. But when the Australians finally signaled a halt, the patrol found itself just 30 meters from an NVA rest site, completely undetected. The Americans were stunned. There had been no noise, no scent trail, no signs of approach. Just methodical patience and terrain mastery. The S team leader whispered 3 words. "We'll watch tonight. No ambush, no engagement. Just observation." The Americans thought it a missed opportunity. The Australians saw it as a window into the enemy's routine. That night, the LRRPs learned something else. The SAS didn't sleep in shifts. They all stayed awake, rotating micro-rests, sipping cold tea, listening to the sounds of the jungle like musicians hearing a familiar song. They tracked enemy movements by footfall patterns and cigarette glows. They noted how the guards changed, who limped, who laughed too loudly, who stayed silent. And all the while they didn't move, not even when a sentry passed within 10 meters. The next day the Australians drew a map by hand of the enemy's habits, weapon placements, supply cache, latrine trail, and exit routes. They proposed an airstrike, not a gunfight. The Americans, once skeptical, now sat in quiet awe. One LRRP later interviewed would say, "They didn't fight like we did. They didn't need to. They knew the enemy before they ever fired. It was like playing chess with a guy who already read your whole playbook." That joint patrol changed everything. The LRRPs began to ask questions, not just about tactics, but philosophy. Why the Australians carried less. Why they fired fewer rounds. Why they stayed still when everything inside you screamed to move. The answers didn't come in lectures. They came in shadows. And the LRRPs were beginning to follow them. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It began with something simple, almost embarrassingly simple. Weight. American LRRPs were used to carrying heavy loads. It was part of the culture. Extra ammo, extra claymores, extra water, extra everything. The mindset was straightforward. Better to have it and not need it than need it and not have it. Except in the Vietnamese jungle, that logic could get you killed. Weight meant noise. Weight meant fatigue. Weight meant slower reaction times. And most importantly, weight meant leaving a bigger signature for NVA trackers who could read the earth like a book. The Australian SAS demonstrated this within days of patrolling together. On one joint mission, an LRRP team noticed something odd. The SAS weren't sweating as hard, weren't breathing as heavily, and didn't stop to rest as often. Their movements were smoother, quieter, and far more deliberate. When the team paused near a stream to refill canteens, one American finally asked the question on everyone's mind. How much gear are you guys even carrying? The SAS patrol commander grinned, shrugged, and tapped the side of his pack. Enough. When pressed, he opened the pack to show what enough meant. A poncho, a small ration pack, a few bandages, a spare magazine or two, and a collapsible stove smaller than a man's palm. No extra clothing, no spare boots, no entrenching tool, no toiletries, no luxury items. Not even a full week of rations, because they moved so light they could go farther and last longer off the land. The Americans were stunned. Their own packs weighed nearly twice as much. Some carried 60 pounds or more. Radios, grenades, claymores, extra batteries, ponchos, spare socks, full M16 loadouts, sea rations, stoves, dry socks, even paperback books for downtime. Useful, sure. But was it essential? The SAS taught them a hard truth. The jungle punished anyone who brought their comfort with them. The lighter you were, the easier it was to move without breaking sticks, cross streams quietly, climb without panting, evade trackers, hide your trail, escape quickly if compromised. And if the worst happened, if they made contact and had to break, a lighter man ran farther, faster, quieter. One LRRP soldier later wrote in his journal, "Patrolling with the Aussies was like patrolling with men who had already died once and didn't want to do it again. They carried nothing they didn't need, nothing. And they made us feel ridiculous for every ounce we brought." Within weeks, LRRP teams began stripping down their gear. Entire checklists were rewritten. Items once considered mandatory were cut. Radios were pared down. Claymores carried only when the mission demanded. Even water discipline improved. Americans learned to refill from streams using SAS methods instead of hauling liters on their backs. The difference was immediate. They moved quieter. They traveled farther. They left fewer traces. And most importantly, they began avoiding contact entirely, just like the SAS. Because if your mission was to stay alive behind enemy lines, speed didn't matter. Silence did. This was the first shift. And once the LRRPs felt the jungle easing its grip, they realized weight wasn't strength. Weight was vulnerability. The Australians had known that all along, and now the Americans were beginning to understand it too. The second change didn't come from the rucksack. It came from the trigger finger. For most American LRRPs, the M16 wasn't just a rifle, it was a safety net. Lightweight, high capacity, capable of both semi and full auto fire, it was the backbone of any contact plan. Standard doctrine encouraged fire superiority. If you made contact, you hit hard, laid down suppressive fire and maneuvered. Spray and move, overwhelm and retreat. But after patrolling with the Australian SAS, that logic began to fray. The Australians didn't spray. They didn't even burst. They fired single shots, deliberate, patient, almost surgical. Sometimes the first burst of contact from an SAS ambush was only 2 or 3 rounds. Then silence. No follow-up. No wild volume. Just one moment of precise violence, and then nothing. At first, LRRPs were confused by it. Some even thought the Australians were underreacting, hesitating. But they weren't. They were choosing. Every round was counted. Every shot had intent. And the effect was profound. Enemy patrols that came under fire from SAS teams didn't know what hit them. They heard 3 rounds, saw 1 or 2 men fall, then nothing. No noise, no movement, just jungle silence swallowing the battlefield again. The confusion was more powerful than any machine gun. NVA squads would freeze, retreat, or break entirely, unsure if they'd just encountered a full platoon or a ghost. The SAS understood what few did. Noise equals information. And in the jungle, the enemy wasn't just listening for where you were. They were listening for who you were, what kind of unit, what direction you were moving, how many men you had, how aggressive you were. Firing 100 rounds might save you in one firefight, but it might get you killed in the next 10. The LRRP started to learn. They began switching their M16s to semi-auto only. Fire discipline became stricter. Team leaders emphasized counted shots. The mission shifted from fire superiority to first-round lethality. Ambushes were redesigned. Fewer guns, tighter fields of fire, faster disengagement. They practiced shooting from brace positions, just like the Australians. Learned how to fire from cover without exposing their silhouettes. How to take one breath, exhale half, and let the shot break calmly, not panicked. And most importantly, they stopped firing unless they had to, because staying hidden was more powerful than hitting hard. One LRRP veteran summed it up years later. We used to think success was about getting out of contact alive. The SAS taught us that success meant never being seen in the first place. It wasn't cowardice, it was control. Because in the jungle, firefights didn't always end with victory. They ended with blood trails, noise, and NVA trackers sweeping through your last known position. The Australians had figured it out early. A bullet not fired was often a life not lost. The LRRPs weren't just copying tactics anymore. They were absorbing a new rhythm, a new mindset, and their fingers began to rest a little longer on the trigger, waiting not for the right shot, but the perfect one. The third change crept in slowly because it wasn't about equipment, it was about mindset. American LRRPs had always used camouflage. They wore standard issue jungle fatigues, blackened their faces, and covered their helmets with foliage. But after working alongside the Australian SAS, they realized that camouflage wasn't just about what you wore, it was about how you thought. The Australians didn't just try to disappear, they expected to. Everything they did, from the color of their face paint to the way they held their rifles, was designed around a single objective: don't get seen. But more than that, it was don't get sensed. Not by sight, not by sound, not by smell. The first thing the LRRPs noticed was the color. Americans often painted their faces black or dark green, assuming that dark means stealth. But in the Vietnamese jungle, filtered through thick canopies and green light, black stood out like ink on a page. The SAS painted their faces with blended tones of muted green, brown, and gray, carefully feathered to break up facial structure. Their necks, ears, and even eyelids were shaded. Some even darkened their teeth with charcoal. They didn't look like soldiers. They looked like shadows. Next came the scent discipline. American troops were often issued soap, shaving cream, foot powder, and even cologne in care packages from home. The SAS? None of it. No deodorant, no scented rations, no tobacco. Their gear was washed in streams or not at all. They wiped down with jungle water or muddy cloth. They didn't smell like humans. And that was the point. NVA trackers were trained to sniff out men as much as find footprints. One excess trooper recalled, "If you smell like a PX, you'll die like one." It wasn't a joke, it was a rule. The LRRP started adjusting. They cut out soaps and chemicals, wrapped their boots and weapons in cloth tape to muffle sounds and reduce shine, removed unnecessary metal, tied foliage to their gear not randomly, but based on the actual plants in the AO. They studied how SAS operators moved through sunlight, never across open patches, always in the dappled zones. They even mimicked how they stood still, not straight, but slouched, hunched, breaking up the human outline. The jungle wasn't fooled by uniforms. It could smell fear, hear arrogance, and see symmetry. The S had simply become students of the jungle's attention span, and now the LRRPs were enrolling too. Soon, American patrols began blending better, staying lower, talking less. A few even adopted the SAS habit of removing their boots while crawling to an observation point, walking barefoot the last 100 meters to eliminate sound. Their enemies didn't see it coming, literally. One LRRP team leader wrote in a letter home, "I used to think camouflage was something you wore. Now I know it's something you become." Camouflage wasn't about hiding from bullets. It was about never giving the enemy a reason to shoot in the first place. And the moment you believed you were visible, that's when you already were. By 1968, the evolution was undeniable. American LRRPs had changed, not because they were ordered to, but because they had witnessed something they couldn't ignore. And the Australians? They noticed too. In the field, it was impossible to fake skill. One jungle patrol together told you everything you needed to know. How a man walked, where his eyes moved, how often he spoke, whether he carried his rifle as a tool or a crutch. The jungle stripped away ego, rank, and accent. It left only competence. At first, the SAS were cautious around their American counterparts. They had heard the stereotypes: loud, fast, overly reliant on firepower. But the LRRPs who came into their AO weren't regular troops. They were selected, hardened, and eager to learn. That alone earned respect. The SAS didn't give lessons. They didn't hand out manuals or deliver speeches. They simply operated. They moved with the jungle, not through it. They crouched in the shadows, listened with their whole bodies, and struck only when absolutely necessary. The Americans observed and adapted. One SAS patrol leader later recalled, "We didn't teach the LRRPs. They figured it out by watching, by surviving, and survive they did." The SAS, in turn, came to admire the Americans' flexibility. Where the Australians were methodical and disciplined, the Americans were improvisational and aggressive. When ambushed, SAS units responded with sharp, brief violence. The LRRPs often responded with bold maneuver. When supplies failed, the Americans scrounged, hacked, built, and solved. Fast. It was a different energy, not better, not worse, just different. Joint patrols soon became more than operational necessity. They became mutual experiments. Americans tried Australian stalking techniques. Australians studied American kit loadouts. Radios, claymores, M79s, even boots were compared. The phrase "not invented here" didn't exist in these units. If it worked, it was copied. If it failed, it was discarded. No politics, just survival. In some after-action reviews, LRRP team leaders openly requested more joint time with SAS units, not to show off, but to grow sharper. One report stated, "The Australians don't talk unless it matters. When they shoot, something drops. I want my men to see that up close." The respect became two-way. Americans began referring to the SAS as ghosts, not just because they moved silently, but because they left no trace, no trash, no boot prints, no scent, no sound. It was unnerving, even to friendly forces. A bond grew in the darkness of the jungle, built not on flag or uniform, but shared struggle. The humidity, the leeches, the NVA patrols that hunted them all the same. In those suffocating nights crouched beneath wet foliage, whispering over static-filled radios, there were no Australians or Americans, just warfighters watching the trees together, waiting. And when the time came to move, they rose as one, shadows in the underbrush. The jungle taught them many things, but one truth stood tallest. In the world of long-range reconnaissance, respect isn't claimed, it's earned in silence. By the final years of the Vietnam War, the influence of the Australian SAS on American LRRP teams had moved beyond tactics. It had seeped into culture. What began as subtle changes in movement and loadout had evolved into something far more profound, a shift in mindset. American long-range reconnaissance patrols, originally conceived around aggressive movement, contact drills, and radio-heavy coordination, had absorbed the Australian emphasis on stealth, patience, and surgical violence. It wasn't just that they carried less gear or painted their faces with more care. It was how they saw the battlefield. They no longer moved to dominate ground. They moved to disappear. They no longer relied on suppressive fire. They relied on stillness. One veteran later remarked, "We stopped thinking of ourselves as hunters. We started thinking like ghosts. The jungle demanded it. With NVA trackers becoming more sophisticated and VC scouts patrolling deeper than ever before, the survival rate of noisy or careless patrols dropped sharply. But those who embraced the SAS way, who melted into the terrain, who planned their movement to the inch and their shots to the second, began to thrive. The LRRPs who operated alongside the Australians returned with stories of four-man teams eliminating entire supply columns, of patrols that set up ambushes so silent even birds didn't fly away, of men who could lie motionless for hours watching the shimmer of heat on an enemy's uniform button and never be seen. These tales weren't exaggerations, they were blueprints. By 1970, entire American LRRP detachments, especially those operating in Corps and the Central Highlands, had adopted what some commanders called the ghost doctrine: pack light, move slow, speak rarely, shoot once. Even the training programs at bases like Nha Trang began to incorporate elements inspired by SAS fieldcraft. Instructors would reference the Australian way as a model for jungle infiltration and evasion. Former SAS veterans were quietly brought in to consult. The exchange had come full circle. But the most important legacy wasn't tactical, it was relational. A mutual respect had formed between two elite brotherhoods. Unlike most conventional alliances, this wasn't born in planning rooms or forged through official diplomacy. It was earned on muddy trails during joint ambushes and beneath monsoon rains when the only thing keeping men alive was the discipline of the man beside them. In later years, many American Special Operations veterans would describe their time with the Australian SAS as transformative. Some even credited their survival to lessons learned from those quiet, sharp-eyed men who spoke little but saw everything. And the Australians? They looked back with pride, not just at how they influenced others, but at how they themselves had grown by sharing the shadows with their American counterparts. There had been no rank in the jungle, only silence, sweat, and steel. As helicopters lifted the last patrols from the jungles of Southeast Asia, one thing was clear. The legacy of those joint patrols wouldn't end with the war. They would echo in the doctrines of every special forces unit that followed, in every corner of the globe, wherever men moved through darkness with purpose. Ghosts don't fade, they pass their silence on.